So firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'll be talking about developing meaningful patient-reported outcomes for use in clinical trials in rare diseases, and I'll be focusing on a case study in spinal muscular atrophy. So before I begin, I'd like to just state that any opinions or information given are based on general industry standards and not the opinions of Roche. And I'd also like to acknowledge all the individuals with spinal muscular atrophy and their families who have taken part in the studies that I'll be describing in this presentation. And of course, as well as that, the contributors and collaborators that you can see here listed on the slide. The work would not be possible without all these organisations. So I'll start by talking about the types of clinical outcomes assessments that are used in clinical trials to assess treatment benefit. And there are 4 types of clinical outcomes and possibly a 5th, which I'll come on to speak about. But we'll start with patient-reported outcomes, which come directly from the patient and obviously are our focus in today's webinar. So patient-reported outcomes are used when concepts are best known to patients. So for example, pain intensity is an example of a patient concept that is best known from a patient-centered perspective. In the middle, we've got observer-reported outcomes. So observer-reported outcomes come from an observer such as a caregiver that's not a healthcare professional and are appropriate, for example, in pediatric indications for caregivers to report, or for example, in indications where patients lack the capacity to provide self-report, and as such a caregiver observer report may be more appropriate. We've also got clinician-reported outcomes, which come directly from a trained healthcare professional following observation of the patient. And in the top right-hand corner, performance-based outcomes. So performance-based outcomes are standardized tasks that are actively undertaken by a patient according to instructions. So examples of this would be something like the 6-minute walk distance or the timed up and go test performed by patients routinely in clinic. And more recently, we have a new type of clinical outcome assessment, which is being labelled patient monitoring COA. And this is where we can routinely monitor patients passively via, for example, a sensor or a wearable. But I'll focus today on patient-reported outcomes, and specifically patient-reported outcomes in rare diseases and the opportunities and the challenge that exist in this space. And the challenges relate to the fact that many patient-reported outcomes are generic and they're not well targeted necessarily to patients living with rare diseases. But there are many opportunities that do exist in this space. And if there's a willingness to engage in patient-reported outcome selection and development early in the drug development lifecycle, in partnership with the patient and the clinical community, this could mean that we have more relevant and sensitive patient-reported outcome measures and endpoints that really capture the concepts of importance to patients living with rare diseases. We have the opportunity to collaborate more closely with regulators and payers to really make sure that we're measuring what matters in rare diseases. We'll have more time to draw together the evidence that is needed to give stakeholders confidence in novel patient-reported outcome endpoints. And of course, ultimately, we'll have the opportunity to better meet the needs of the patient community living with the rare disease. So in rare diseases, targeted qualitative and quantitative data is needed to inform optimal patient-reported outcome development and selection. And I'll just briefly describe the steps that we go through to develop a patient-reported outcome for use in clinical trials. So we start with robust qualitative research to understand the symptoms and the impacts of importance in a given disease. And this is usually via literature reviews, if literature exists. But where literature does not exist, patient and caregivers semi-structured interviews which follow health authority guidance and methodology. We'll then take this evidence and look at whether existing patient-reported outcomes are adequate and whether they're adequately capturing the concepts of importance. And if they don't, we'll consider developing something new or adapting an existing measure. And throughout this process, we'll continue to get patient feedback and caregiver feedback and feedback from patient advocacy groups to really make sure that we're measuring the concepts that are important. Once we have the measure in place, either an existing PRO or something new or adapted, we can implement this in early stage clinical trials as exploratory outcomes. And this will involve other clinical outcome assessment data collection as well. And therefore, we can generate evidence documenting the psychometric measurement properties of the patient-reported outcome, which is a critical part of the development journey, where we can better understand the reliability, the validity, and the ability to detect change of the PRO. As well as this, we can look at what constitutes a meaningful change or a minimally clinically important difference in the patient population. And this is often determined using statistical methods, but also patient and caregiver input. And all of this culminates in a better understanding of the treatment effect in conjunction with other clinical outcome assessments. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll focus on a case study in spinal muscular atrophy. So spinal muscular atrophy is a rare genetic disease caused by a deficiency in SMN protein, which leads to progressive muscle weakness and loss of motor function. And its phenotypic spectrum is classically divided into 4 subtypes. So 1 being the most severe SMA type, 3 to 4 being the least severe. But the symptoms and the impacts are very variable depending on SMA type. So we have progressive motor function weakness, difficulties completing everyday activities, and in more severe cases, difficulties swallowing as well as respiratory difficulties. So this heterogeneous impact of SMA makes selecting clinical outcomes challenging, but typically in clinical trials, we focus on assessing motor function by clinician-reported outcomes that typically focus on achieving motor milestones. But a need did exist to develop a relevant and a sensitive patient-reported outcome measure to focus on the concept of daily living and difficulties completing everyday activities for use in the type 2-3 SMA population in clinical trials. So now I'll describe the process we went through to develop this patient-reported outcome. And it started with qualitative semi-structured interviews with patients and caregivers in the US and the UK. And what you can see there in the small icon is the result of this work, which was the development of a conceptual model. So a conceptual model is a visual depiction of the disease experience that comes from the patient perspective, so the symptoms and impacts that are experienced. And this work involved other industry collaborators, it involved clinical experts, and also patient advocacy groups, including Cure SMA and SMA Europe, who are involved in the study to identify patients and ensure the appropriate interpretation of the results. But what was clear from this research was that the concept of independence was critical for individuals living with type 2 and 3 SMA. And so we set about looking for a patient-reported outcome that could capture this concept, and were not able to find an adequately targeted measure for this population. And as a result, we developed a scale that's called the SMA Independence Scale, or the SMACE for short. And we ran a series of patient and caregiver interviews and subsequently incorporated this measure in a clinical trial called Sunfish Part 2. And here we included a patient-reported outcome for individuals aged 12 and older, and a caregiver-reported outcome for individuals aged 2 and older. And from this clinical trial, we were able to test the measurement properties of the instrument in terms of its psychometrics. And we were also able to generate patient and caregiver-reported evidence of the treatment effect that could go alongside the other clinical outcome assessments, such as the ClinROs that were included in the study. So you may be wondering what is included in this SMACE, and this visual shows the key domains. So we have bathing and hygiene items, items around dressing, eating and drinking, picking up and moving small objects, and hand dexterity. And the measure itself is focused on the level of assistance a patient needs to complete these activities. And when we ran our patient and caregiver studies, we heard from families that the measure included the important concepts and that it was readily understood by patients and caregivers completing the tool. And when we included this in our clinical trial and conducted appropriate psychometric testing, we derived a 22-item total score, with higher scores being associated with better ability or greater function in completing activities of daily living. And we've since gone on to share this measure with some updates based on our psychometric work. So it's now available for broader patient, clinical, and community use. So I'd like to close by just talking briefly about some of the opportunities for learnings from this work. And the first is to say that novel patient-reported outcome development needs to occur as early as possible in the drug development life cycle. As you can see on the prior slide, we started in 2016, but it takes many years to run the appropriate patient studies and the appropriate psychometric tests. As well as this, we have an opportunity to collaborate with other stakeholders. So the first study I described was as the result of collaboration with 5 other industry sponsors, a clinical outcome assessment partner, 2 clinical experts, and patient advocacy groups. So we've got the opportunity to avoid duplicative qualitative research. And finally, the concept of interest needs to be relevant across a broad population. And this is particularly challenging in rare diseases where you have heterogeneous symptoms and impacts. But what we found from our research was that maintaining independence was key. And therefore, we were able to develop an outcome that could capture change in our weakest patients, but also our strongest patients as well. So to conclude, patient and caregiver input is critical in the development and the selection of patient-reported outcomes. And this is in order to ensure that we assess meaningful concepts which meet appropriate standards. And early and systematic involvement of patients and caregivers and patient organisations is critical, and this must be sustained. So input to the design, the conduct and the interpretation of the results that surround patient-reported outcome generation. And I'll close by once again thanking all the patients and all the collaborators who made this research possible. Thank you.